Welcome to the Education Scotland podcast. In every episode, we are joined by teachers, professionals and experts to unpack some of the big questions and topics facing the education sector in Scotland. Stay informed with the latest on education in Scotland by subscribing to our podcast.
Well, hello everyone and welcome to the Education in Scotland podcast. My name's Ollie Bray and I'm one of the Strategic Directors at Education in Scotland, and I'm joined by Andy Creamer, who is Head of Learning, Teaching and Assessment here at Education in Scotland. And as I've said many times before, Andy is involved in lots of work in Education in Scotland, but particularly work around the curriculum improvement cycle, and I suppose in particular over the last number of months thinking about the relationship of the different curriculum areas and what we call the technical framework, but more about that in a second. So, hello, Andy.
Well, thanks, Ollie.
Yeah. I don't know whether you have already listened to the first podcast in this mini series, but a couple of weeks ago, Andy and I sat down and we talked around the first paper. Or the first discussion paper that we produced as part of the curriculum improvement cycle, which was called A Background and a Case for Change. What I would say is that if you've not listened to that podcast, stop listening to this podcast now and go back and listen to that one first, because that will mean that this one will make a lot more sense. This is the second one in this series, and we'll give you a quick spoiler alert for the third one a little bit later on. So, Andy, we're going to be talking about this paper, Curriculum Improvement Cycle Towards an Evolved Technical Framework, that was published in December 2024, around that. So I suppose this is the question I always ask you, isn't it? But do you just want to just explain to folks what we mean by a technical framework to start with, because that might be useful, and then maybe just a couple of words which sum up this paper if you were stuck in an elevator with me for 2 minutes.
Okay, technical framework, really looking at what teachers use for planning and organising the curriculum. So, for example, the experience and outcomes, national guidance, course specifications, benchmarks, and so on. We're not talking about the curriculum in entirety. We've still got the why of the curriculum, the 4 capacities, and I think one of the key messages that came from the pilot reviews was there's really strong support for the purposes of the curriculum in Scotland from practitioners and also from other key stakeholders, and really looking at what is it that we can do to better realise the ambitions for CFE, and evolving the technical framework to take account of changes that have taken place in society, technological changes, economic changes, social changes and so on, seems to be an appropriate approach to better realise those ambitions.
So this is a really exciting piece of work, isn't it? And it's a big piece of work now, because our current technical framework we've had for a number of years around that. Both you and I lived through the implementation of that, in schools. But I'm personally sort of delighted to hear, and again, it's reinforced by the OECD and the national discussion that there's strong appetite for the purpose of Scottish education, those 4 capacities, that we want young people to be learners, individuals, citizens, and contributors. And you'll notice there, folks, that I've missed out the adjectives. I think we need to get over the adjectives as we move forward for that. And then what have we got, like within our sort of tool set to build it? Well, that's the curriculum, isn't it? Around that. And again, I think really strong appetite within Scotland for our definition of curriculum. That's the totality of all planned experiences for children and young people, made up of 4 things. Sometimes we forget that, but curriculum areas and subjects is one of them, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. But also remembering the importance, the equal importance really of interdisciplinary learning, and of course to do interdisciplinary learning, you've got to do the disciplines well. Sometimes I think people forget that. Opportunities for personal achievement, and then the one that I think that we sometimes forget, is the life and the ethos of the school community, and the importance of those kind of place-based approaches around that. So, Andy, we were talking last time around the paper Background and a Case for Change around that, and there were a number of conclusions, like at the end of that paper, and I know that one of the first things that you and others did, like when you reached those conclusions, was to use some of those conclusions to almost develop a new criteria for what a new technical framework might look like. And I'm going to make no excuses for this. I'm actually going to read from the report, because I think these bits are important, because I think it's important that folks that are listening to the podcast know that we've done this around a set of criteria, and haven't just picked sort of random things out of there. So the criteria that was developed then was that any new technical framework, so remember that's the things that may replace these and those and the benchmarks and other things, it needed to provide parameters for the selection of content and a process for deprioritising and prioritising. People have told us time and time again the curriculum is cluttered. Greater clarity on the knowledge and the skills that learners should have at key points in their learning, developmentally appropriate points, obviously, as part of that. Clarity on progression from early learning and childcare. Clarity on the role of the purposes of knowledge and skills. Adaptable to the realities and different natures of sectors, but also curriculum areas as well as part of that. Flexibility and autonomy below the level of these kind of key ideas or big ideas. We'll talk about those a little bit later on. A 3 to 18 framework and consistency with the senior phase. Again, sometimes we hear from that OECD report there's a disconnect between the BG and the senior phase. And then the last one, and I know that we'll get a chance to talk about this later because it's something that both you and I are really interested in, is a clearer position in terms of cross-curricular themes and cross-curricular expectations. So they're not seen as a bolt-on and an add-on from there. So do the pilot reviews, around that, we talked a little about that last time. We've developed this kind of set of criteria to sort of try and take this forward. What happened next around this?
Well, as well as the finding from the pilots, we also looked at a number of other sources. We had some messages that came from the OECD report itself. There was some advice about considering a big ideas approach. We were also directed towards look at how some other systems particularly tried to address the position of knowledge, and in particular their approaches that could be characterised as a know, do, understand approach. We also looked at how other countries reviewed their curriculum and the processes that they went through and the outputs. We engaged with educators from a range of different international systems, so for example Estonia, British Columbia, New Zealand, Australia, and we also engaged with academics and educational research to see what did this tell us about addressing and the different types of curriculum frameworks and different, I think it's referred to in the paper as curriculum typologies, and to come down, if you like, to address some of the key issues that came out of from the pilots, in particular the position of knowledge, the need to clarify what knowledge learners should have at key points in their learning, and that issue that you mentioned earlier on about redefining the relationship between cross-curricular areas and the curriculum areas as well.
And I suppose it's sort of fair to mention as well that obviously along the way we've involved people from the pilot curriculum reviews, we've involved other people, like in this journey that we've been on, we've involved members of the curriculum assessment board as part of this, so it really has been a collaborative effort, I think, as we move through it. So one of the things that you mentioned is the is the know, do, understand model around that. I mean, when you read through the paper, there's obviously a bit of a focus on knowledge because that's the challenge that the OECD set us. But of course, that doesn't mean that we're discounting skills. I mean, that's the do, isn't it? As part of the model around that. But one of the things that I think is interesting and that I really like and actually really excites me as part of the model is when we're talking about a know, do, understand. When we're thinking about the understand part, you use the notion of big ideas, around that as well. Now, I am aware, like anything in education reform, is that sometimes we all use the same words, but we're talking about completely different things. And I imagine that was no different when we think about big ideas around that. So, you want to talk a little bit about big ideas so that people can understand that in a bit more detail?
I suppose one of the challenges is big ideas means different things in different educational systems. Some big ideas are bigger than other big ideas, as it were. And also, as we looked at the approaches taken internationally, we also wanted to avoid, I think, definitely, which is we're not just lifting what other systems use or other systems do. It's looking to develop something that fits in with our context, that addresses the realities and the position of the 4 capacities, and it's meaningful in addressing some of the messages that came out the pilot reviews. I think the big ideas approach that we're adopting address the challenges that were to declutter the curriculum by providing those parameters. What is it we want learners to understand as part of their journey through the curriculum? But also it starts to address, I think, a challenge internationally that's been identified about moving away from something that really promotes rote learning and memorisation, that makes connections between what learners understand, that identifies the important learning that learners should have, and also it's something that provides greater coherence, and I think that should be, and with our proposals that's the starting point as we go through the curriculum improvement work. And I think the feedback that we've had through the pilot reviews, through the work that's already started in the curriculum improvement cycle, through the work we've carried out on core competencies, where we've tried to identify the big ideas in areas such as financial literacy, digital literacy, sustainability, entrepreneurship, is that's an essential starting point to identify what is it we want learners to understand before we start looking at what does that mean learners need to know and need to be able to do.
I think you said a couple of really, really important things there, and something which I've stolen from you before, around that. It's just because you know something doesn't mean that you understand something around that, and that's a really, really important point, isn't there? Around that. The other thing that I really like in the paper, as we're going through it, is again, you've mentioned bits of this already. Is you've got some examples in here about some other countries from around the world, British Columbia, New Zealand use that big ideas model, but also how different places around the world use big ideas for different curriculum areas. So you've got a mass example from Singapore, I think it is. You've also got a selection of big ideas from science and also from RE as part of that as well. But the bit I think I really like, and this comes back to what we were talking about in the first podcast, is we've not tried to retrofit anything from one system and put it into Scotland, is that we've developed our own methodology for that. So I suppose just for the folks that are listening, when we think about a big idea in Scotland around that, we're defining that as a big idea that captures the core understanding children and young people will develop in a particular area of the curriculum from early learning and childcare onwards. It will set out important overarching ideas and concepts that have relevance and meaning for learners, and it will support progression and a guide for the selection of content around that. So just before we talk about, I suppose, the know and the do, Andy, could you, and I know we haven't developed the big ideas yet as part of that. We've given some examples like in the back of the document, but what might a big idea look like, around that, and how would that help people sort of select and deselect content? Imagine.
I think a big idea should sum up what we want learners to understand as they make their journey through a curriculum area. For instance, I think it should give an indication of what are the concepts we would hope learners to develop an understanding in that conceptual understanding, and be able to identify and then help provide those parameters for decisions about the selection of content. If we're going to deepen understanding, if we're going to deepen learning, we need to spend more time and focus on the important concepts, and those big ideas should be the important things that we think learners need to know, and will need to evolve as society changes, as the education system refreshes itself and future orientates itself. So the big ideas become the starting point for the process of updating and reviewing the curriculum. And as
I'm listening to you, talking there, around that, I'm imagining, and maybe I'm being a bit clumsy with my words, but the big ideas themselves can also be used as a bit of a filter for prioritising and deprioritising in terms of how that would work to make that work.
And in effect, I think, the idea of big ideas isn't new. You can trace its roots back to the 1920s, I think, if not earlier, but also some recent work, particularly big ideas in science, for instance, but they could provide that coherence with learning. I think some feedback, and I think some feedback that's captured in the national discussion is about the importance that learners just don't learn a series of disconnected facts, and the big ideas provide that opportunity to provide coherence, if you like, to provide the pegs or the coat hangers where you should be able to hang that knowledge or hang that learning on and make connections between, and they should link back to the key big ideas within a curriculum area.
Yeah. And I know, and you mentioned the big ideas of science, and you give some examples of that. In the report, of course, Wyn Harlan was credited for that back in 2010. And the reason that I mention it is, although it was the international conference, of course, the ideas of the big ideas in the science was born on the Bonnie banks of Loch Lomond.
Exactly.
It was a conference that was set in Scotland. Around that, and it's interesting. I think that. That we've seen recently publications, even from the Institute of Physics, that have got their own approaches to sort of big ideas as well. I mean, independently from this piece of work, but it seems like the planets are aligning, to use another physics expression as part of that. So again, a couple of other things that you said there around that. So that's the kind of the understand part, of the know do understand, and you talked a little bit there about conceptual understanding around that, and in the report, we'll talk about the know and the do now. You also talk a little bit about conceptual knowledge, and again, I suppose just for the benefit, for the folks that are listening. So there's quite a helpful definition of conceptual knowledge, on page 21 here. So conceptual knowledge involves understanding the relationships between the key ideas and concepts with an area of study. It enables individuals to see how various concepts are interrelated and how they fit into broader frameworks, facilitating deeper learning. That's the important part, isn't it? And the application of knowledge in meaningful context, around that. So if you like the pegs, as you've described it, to sort of hang the knowledge on. So do you want to speak a little bit more about the know and the do part of the framework?
And I think going back to one of the original messages from the pilots about need to clarify the position of knowledge, well, the know bit provides that opportunity, provides that clarification, and it comes back to, I think, some key messages that you could know something, but you didn't necessarily understand it. You can have memorization, for example, and I think the important thing is about deepening understanding. Now, knowledge develops that understanding, but it develops it by making connections with prior learning, making connections with other knowledge that supports that conceptual understanding, but also making connections with other concepts as well. And I think by making those connections, you deepen understanding. And I think a key thing that has come out from across the pilots from other countries that have adopted this approach is the significance of developing conceptual understanding, and has been the basis, if you like, for the evolution of the technical framework to focus on developing that and deepening that conceptual understanding as learners make their journey through the curriculum.
And I think that the point, and again with the model of it here, is that to develop that conceptual understanding, learners need to be able to know and to be able to combine the two things together, which is the important part. I think that sometimes, the argument around skills versus knowledge is almost bipolar, and of course that's a completely ridiculous thing. The two are completely integrated as part of it.
And I think it's really sort of imagine this as a sense of layers, where we're talking about with the big ideas, what do we want learners to understand, and then from that, what do we want learners to know and be able to do to develop that understanding. And there's been that how that then moves into that layer, and then moving into a third layer to look at what does that look like as learners are making progress through the curriculum, and what does progression in that knowledge and skills look like.
So I think that's a really important point, and we should maybe just sort of recap that, because that notion of layers that you've described there is something that comes through really, really strongly, in the report, and that almost, if you like, forms the basis, doesn't it, for the proposed new technical framework. So again, just to kind of go over that again, and I'll just read from the report. So first of all, we establish what we want learners to understand. That's the big ideas as part of that. From those big ideas, we establish what we want learners to know and be able to do to develop that understanding from that. But obviously, you need to develop that knowledge, that knowing and doing over time. So really, then what we're really thinking about there is we're thinking about progression. So that third layer would be more detail indicating the expected knowledge and skills at different points of a learning journey that could be provided as the next layer to clarify what progression might look like as learners move through the different levels of their education.
And that goes back to, if you like, the criteria that you mentioned at the start, some of the key messages that came out of the pilots about needing to provide greater clarity on what progression looks like. We've had some really strong messages in some of the testing that we've carried out so far with, if you like, the initial sort of iterations of the evolved framework, particularly from, for example, primary teachers, about providing greater clarity about progression within a level as well as between levels. And then I think you've also got the issue about ensuring seamless progression between the BGE and the senior phase. And I think the opportunities that exist as part of qualification reform and about the position of conceptual understanding as being foundations of qualifications is also quite significant.
And I suppose just sort of taking that a little bit further when we're thinking about the senior phase, around that. I mean, one of the pushback's not the right word, I'm not sure, but one of the tensions is that we often get is a disconnect between the BG and the senior phase. So what is proposed as part of one of the annexes, in here is an example of how a know, do, understand model, could be used to produce currently what we might call a course specification, for example, around that. So being able to align the different bits of work there.
And that again was a key message that came out from the pilots, which was the need to address the disconnect. I think effectively what we had was two different frameworks. The E's and O's and course specifications in the senior phase that often use different language, but where they use the same language didn't necessarily mean the same things. And I think the opportunity that we have now, and part of the evolved framework, is saying we can develop a consistent approach from 3 to 18 that provides clarity on what we want learners to know and be able to do, and provides clarity on what progression looks like and bridges that gap between the BGE and the senior phase, and does so in a way that still allows and promotes the diversity of pathways in the senior phase. And I think that's an important thing, that we're not looking at a completely linear framework that goes into the senior phase, but it still provides the range of different pathways that meets the needs of different learners as part of their journey.
And I think that's another important point that you've made there, because when we were talking about doing the systematic review, of the Scottish curriculum, we've already mentioned we're not ripping things up and starting again. We're evolving the technical framework. We've talked already about the importance of the capacities, the importance of the context of learning, but the other bit that comes through really strongly, national discussion is a case in point where this is really emphasised, is the opportunities and the pathways that young people get in the senior phase around that. So we don't want a technical framework that stifles that, and it seems like that helps. So just going back to one of the other criteria around that, because we've talked a little bit about the sort of senior phase. One of the other criteria was to take into account, obviously, different sectors and subjects. Sectors are taken into account because we're talking about progression frameworks and developmentally appropriate progression. As an opportunity of that. But what about subject areas? Around that. So you've got a couple of examples in the annex here. But do you want to just talk a little bit about that? How you've sort of tried to.
Well, I think an important point, and again, one of the criteria was trying to develop a framework that's adaptable to the reality of different subjects. And I think from some of the work that we've done and engagement with practitioners, engagement with other stakeholders, is that in some curriculum areas, they might be looking for to reflect the structure and knowledge within those areas, something that might be a bit more sequential in developing, but in other areas they prefer broad statements of progression. Say, for example, across a level. So what we've tried to do is illustrate in the annexes what that could look like in different areas. So it's not a one-size-fits-all model, but is adaptable to the reality of different subjects, and it's responsive and flexible enough to take into account that subjects are different. Maths is different for expressive arts, for instance. So it's trying to ensure that, and maybe address one of the criticisms that has been levelled about CFE as being a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah, and again, just the examples that you've got in the back here, when you talk about your sort of layer 3, around that, the examples that I see that you've given here, and they are just examples, folks, by the way. That's the disclaimer I'm putting out there, is that it is kind of sequential, because there are some things you need to be able to know and need to be able to do before you move on to the next thing around that. Whereas in health and well-being, for example, it might depend on the maturity of the class, what's developmentally appropriate around that, the local context of things. So that's an interesting way to do things. Should we just talk about the annexes around that, Andy? Is that all right? Because again, I think that folks will be interested about this, and I know we were just sort of joking about that there. You probably sort of heard us laughing, because one of the things that we've done sort of during the pilot work is that people couldn't imagine what this would look like. That was the challenge that we were sort of trying to solve within this. So what we've tried to do as part of the annexes is to often sort of work with practitioners, either some of the pilot groups, some of the groups that have evolved into the wider curriculum areas, and we've done some testing, around some of these things. But we've used and adapted the current E's and O's and current examination syllabuses just to look what this looks like in illustration. So it's just really important that folks that have downloaded this document and look at this aren't thinking, that's what the new curriculum is going to be, because actually that's the old curriculum. It's presented in a different way, around that, because we've not got onto that. We've not got onto that part of that yet.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things that has come out of the core competency work. I think when we illustrate some examples of big ideas, I think the participants in the co-design groups really got what we're meaning by it. And I think what we've tried to do with the annex is illustrate what it could look like, as in the structure, the different layers. But as you say, we've taken the current E's and O's. We've taken the course specifications. We've tried to illustrate what this could look like to provide greater clarity on the position of knowledge, what it could look like across the BGE and the senior phase, but in no way are those the final versions of the new technical framework, because that's what the role of the design groups in the curriculum improvement cycle is. They'll be the groups that will be deciding, if you like, the content of those. And
I don't know how well this will sound or imagine if people are listening to this, but as I sort of flick through the document now, just going back to the layers that Andy was talking about as well, what I see, for example, in the examples here of the annexes, we've got a number of big ideas for a number of curriculum areas. In those big ideas, we've got those broad overarching statements, but the concepts, are highlighted, so that's really, really clear around that. We've then got a section actually then defining what those concepts are. So again, making sure that we're all using the same words and talking about the same thing around that. Then we kind of get into our layer 2. What do we want learners to be able to know and do? And I noticed that from this example, that's broken down into early level, first level, third level, in terms of the different examples that we've got. We won't talk about this today, but we know that we've got a tension in the system around fourth level and SCQF level 4, and that's something that you highlight in the report to be sort of tied out later on. And then when I get to my third level, we've then got those different progression frameworks. And again, you've given some examples here of maths, but also health and well-being as well, about what that might look like. But again, this is focusing on what young people need to know at that point in their learning. So what I'm not seeing in here, for example, are any I can statements, which is very different, isn't it, from what we did before?
And it's focusing on that conceptual understanding. I think it's making clear what concepts we're hoping to develop that understanding in. I think one of the bits of feedback that we had during the course of the pilots were that, you might be able to do something, but that doesn't mean you understand why you're doing it. And I think that we need to, if you like, rebalance and have a greater focus on developing that conceptual understanding, because that's the way you can apply your knowledge in new and unfamiliar contexts. And by applying it, you further deepen that conceptual understanding. And I think that's one of the key aspects that when we looked internationally what other countries were doing, they'd identified that as a key priority, focusing on the application of knowledge, often in real-world situations, and the relevance in that for the learner's journey. And
we often hear this term, don't we? Digressing slightly, but we often hear this term, future-orientated curriculum. But what you're saying there, being able to take the understanding and apply that in new and unfamiliar context, that is a future-orientated curriculum around that, because you're equipping the children and young people with the understanding, the knowledge, and the skills that they need in order to survive and thrive in 2025, and beyond.
And maybe going back to some of the original aspirations of CFE, I just think to my own time in school, and one of the early messages was about applying knowledge in new and unfamiliar contexts. And so we're not looking at, going back to an earlier comment about replacing CFE, we're looking at evolving the technical framework to better realise the ambitions behind CFE.
So we've talked about the document. We've got this document which is proposing, if you like, an evolved technical framework around that. If we went through back to the original kind of criteria in terms of what we've described, is that, it does clearly for me clarify the role and purpose of knowledge. I think there's greater clarity on the knowledge and the skills that the learners should have at key points in their learning. Certainly clarity on progression. We've talked about that, and developmentally appropriate progression as well, which is important, obviously. It's a clearer position on cross-curricular expectations, because that's built in around there.
And that has to be embedded in the framework instead of being seen as a useful add-on.
We've got flexibility and autonomies for teachers and practitioners, because we're not talking about the contexts that young people in. We're talking about we're talking about the actual knowledge and skills around that. The big ideas in themselves provide parameters for selection of content and a process of prioritising and deprioritising. Imagine we'll need some other tools to help people do that as well, people that are very attached to what they've been doing. Takes into account different natures of sectors and curriculum areas, and then really interesting about how the framework could align with the senior phase. So I suppose just to sort of finish off, what might be quite useful to know is that that in order to kind of get to this stage, there's been a bit of testing, hasn't there, to date, and the testing will obviously kind of continue. But maybe we'll explain a little bit about when you or others have been out and about, just showing this to people, getting feedback and other things.
So we've been engaging with teachers in schools. We've engaged teachers in some focus groups. So, for example, in maths and science, for instance, relatively recently, we're going out to schools. We're also going out and speaking to young people as part of the work that we're doing on the core competencies and getting some clear messages back. We're also been engaging, for example, head teachers. We've been sharing our thinking and getting feedback from, for example, local authorities and ADES. So we're looking to pull in, and also professional associations as well. So we're looking to pull in as much feedback, because we see this as an iterative process. So we're looking and we're developing it, we're getting feedback, we're refining it, we're developing it further. And I think that's a strength in the approach that we're taking. We're not sort of coming out with something and publishing it and saying that's it. We're looking at getting feedback and evolving it as part of the evolution of the technical framework itself.
And it just feels like a really collaborative effort, you know, and a different way of working that we've done before. Andy, that's great. So again, if you're interested, folks, in finding out the download link to this paper, put this in the show notes below, but also on the Curriculum Improvement Cycle website, which is scotlandscurriculum.scot, and you can find the links to that, and you can download both papers there. And that's the second in a series. And then, Andy, we've got a third paper coming out, which we're hoping to publish in March 2025. We're calling that "Working Together to Make Change Happen," which we'll talk a little bit about how this might look like in practice as we start to think about a little bit about the change. And I suppose other folks that are just that are listening to this recently, we're recording this in early January, but we're about to advertise for opportunities for people to be involved in the wider curriculum improvement cycle work as well. You know, and these will be the people that will have the opportunity to sort of lean in to help us co-create the new curriculum. So that's great. Good. Andy, thanks so much for your time.
Okay,
really appreciate it. Thank you.
Right, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to subscribe for notification of when a new episode is published. If there is a topic you would like to hear featured on this podcast, get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. Follow us on our social media channels for all the latest news from Education Scotland. Education Scotland is a Scottish Government executive agency charged with supporting quality and improvement in Scottish education.